Participating in a 10-week ACFT-specific periodized physical training program improves ACFT total and individual event scores in U.S. Army soldiers. The research question was for U.S. Army soldiers of the 101st Airborne Division Air Assault at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. Is there a difference in ACFT total as well as individual event scores on the ACFT when soldiers participate in a 10-week ACFT-specific periodized physical training program compared to standard unit physical training? The Army Combat Fitness Test was designed to assess overall combat-related physical fitness. The events that are on the ACFT are designed to replicate some of the types of physical tasks that would be required for soldiers to perform in an operational or deployed environment. There's 6 events on the ACFT, each scored on a scale of 0 to 100, and then a composite score is generated for the total ACFT score. For the 6 events, they are performed in this testing order, beginning with the 3 repetition maximum deadlift, followed by the standing power throw, the hand release push-ups, sprint drag carry, the leg tuck, and finally the 2-mile run. The study sample was comprised of U.S. Army soldiers of the 101st Airborne Division Air Assault. A total of 70 subjects participated in the study. Soldiers were randomized to either the ACFT-specific periodized physical training group, 35 of the 70, and then the remaining 35 were randomized to the control group, in this case, standard unit physical training. The study design was a two-group pre-test, post-test randomized controlled trial. So after randomization of the 70 eligible participants to either the ACFT-specific periodized physical training group or the standard unit physical training group, the control group, each group completed a pre-test ACFT 5 days prior to the 10-week intervention period, and 5 days following the 10-week intervention period, a post-test ACFT was completed. Research hypothesis. So we hypothesized that the soldiers participating in the 10-week ACFT-specific periodized physical training program were going to demonstrate greater overall ACFT scores as well as greater individual event scores compared to the standard unit physical training group. The hypotheses will be tested a priori at an alpha level of p less than 0.05 for rejection of the null hypothesis. A mean change in post-test scores of at least 15% is considered clinically meaningful. The first null hypothesis suggests that there will be no difference between total ACFT scores between groups following the 10-week intervention period, and the subsequent 6 null hypotheses are all specific to the individual events on the ACFT, again indicating that there will be no difference between the 2 groups following the 10-week intervention period. A priori data analysis plan. The statistical test was anticipated to be a multivariate analysis of variance based on there being 2 groups with 7 quantitative outcome variables. Again, the ACFT total score and 6 individual event scores. There was 1 outlier that was removed based on the Mahalanobis distance, which was ultimately due to a data entry error. The scores actually exceeded the total possible ACFT score as well as an individual event score. Multicollinearity was present due to the fact that the ACFT total score is comprised of the 6 individual event scores. Ultimately, it was performed, since we could not perform the multivariate analysis of variance, there were 7 independent samples t-tests that were performed with a Bonferroni adjustment of the alpha level to 0.007. The initial alpha value of 0.05 divided by the 7 outcome measures equated to this 0.007 alpha level. And this was done to reduce the chance of a type 1 error secondary to performing multiple independent samples t-test. All assumptions were met for the independent samples t-test in that groups were independent of each other. The outcome measures, i.e. the ACFT total and individual event scores, were of ratio level measurement, and subjects were randomly assigned to the intervention groups. Data were also normally distributed. The results of the independent samples t-test, what we can see here over on the left are outcome variable, again 7 of these total, the 3 repetition maximum deadlift, standing power throw, hand release push-up, sprint drag carry, leg tuck, 2-mile run, and ACFT total score. our alpha value adjusted to p less than 0.007. Of all of these different outcome measures, there was only a statistically significant difference following the 10-week intervention period in the hand release push-up scores, as well as the sprint drag carry scores, favoring the ACFT specific periodized physical training group. Here we have all of our means plus or minus standard deviations for your reference, as well as the results of each independent sample's t-test. So the null hypothesis for the hand release push-up and sprint drag carry was rejected based on this statistically significant result for these two outcome measures. And all other outcome measures, the null hypotheses were accepted given that there was not statistical significance. From a practical significance perspective, we indicated initially that a 15%, a mean change in 15% between pre-test and post-test ACFT scores for each group is considered clinically significant or practically significant. For the 3 repetition maximum deadlift, while there wasn't any statistically significant difference between the experimental group and the control group, there was a practically significant improvement in the ACFT specific periodized physical training group. Here we can see there was a mean change or improvement in 23% for the experimental group or the ACFT specific periodized physical training group versus a 12% improvement in the control group or standard physical training group. Looking at the lower bound of the 95% confidence interval of this mean percent improvement, this was 20% for the experimental group, which exceeds that 15% threshold, whereas here the mean value did not exceed the 15% threshold, and the lower bound of the 95% confidence interval was also less than the 15% threshold. So there was a practically significant change that is clinically meaningful for the 3 repetition maximum deadlift for the soldiers who were participating in the ACFT specific physical training group. For the standing power throw, again, similar to the 3 repetition maximum deadlift, we can see a mean change, 22% improvement versus only a 9% improvement in the standing power throw. The lower bound of the 95% confidence interval for the experimental group was 16.5%, which exceeds that 15% threshold for a clinically significant difference or a clinically significant improvement. And here we can actually see that the lower bound of the 95% confidence interval for this percent change was actually less than pre-test ACFT scores. So there's a chance that scores may actually go down participating in the standard physical training group in the actual population. So practical significance was also present for the ACFT specific physical training group relative to the standing power throw. For the hand release push-up, there, as we initially indicated, there was statistically significant difference between the two groups. We can see if we go back to this section here for our t-test results. Mean plus or minus standard deviation was for the hand release push-up was 89.51 plus or minus 10.88 versus 78.41 plus or minus 16.68. So there was a statistically significant difference here. And there was also a practically significant difference, as would be expected. Here we can see the lower bound of the 95% confidence interval was 44.5%, whereas the actual mean percent improvement was 51%, a very large increase in hand release push-up scores in the ACFT specific physical training group, whereas in the control group there was still a 24% mean improvement. However, the lower bound of the 95% confidence interval did overlap or go below that 15% threshold, again favoring the ACFT specific periodized physical training group. Sprint drag carry, again, this was our second outcome variable that did have a statistically significant difference. Now if we go up here, we can see again 73.06 plus or minus 10.07 versus 61.76 plus or minus 19.69. So a very large standard deviation here in the control group, which when we consider down here, the actual mean change was fairly similar if just looking at strictly the mean change, a 48% versus a 45% improvement. However, that large variability in the standard deviation is likely what's contributing to that statistically significant difference. Here we can see the lower bound of the 95% confidence interval was about 41% versus 29% in the control group. Leg tuck, no statistically significant difference, as was demonstrated in our t-test results table. However, practically, again, there is a clinically meaningful change here, given that the mean percent improvement was 23% with a lower bound of that confidence interval range of this being 17.5%. And the actual mean change in leg tuck scores was actually less than pre-test scores. So there was a mean reduction in leg tucks, which is not ideal. And that lower bound ranged all the way down to -8%. So performance very, very much so went down in the standard physical training group relative to the leg tuck. But here, what we can see is, although there was no statistically significant difference based on our t-test results here, 80.17 versus 74.74, we can see that there is indeed a clinically meaningful difference here. For the 2-mile run, interestingly, so this was the only outcome variable where there was neither statistically significant difference between the two groups, nor a clinically or practical significant difference. A mean percent change in only 11%, so an 11% mean improvement in the experimental group versus a 5% improvement in the control group. Lower bound of that confidence interval range being 5.5%, which again is less than that 15% threshold, as is the actual mean percent improvement. And down here, 5%, certainly less than 15%, as is the lower bound being at -0.75%. So neither of these groups had a statistically or practically significant improvement following the 10-week intervention period. ACFT total scores, again, there was no statistically significant difference here. If we go back to our chart and we review here, 492.37 plus or minus 66.86 versus 446.29 plus or minus 99.3. Again, this ACFT total score being out of 600 points. A pretty large, variation here, almost 50-point difference. But again, we have these very large standard deviations, which is likely contributing to that lacking statistically significant difference. However, again, when we look at the percent change in the mean based on each group after the 10-week training periods or the 10-week intervention period, there was a mean 28% improvement between pre-test and post-test scores in the experimental group versus 16% in the control group. This here, the lower bound of that confidence interval range is 22%, which again still exceeds our 15% threshold, versus 16% here as the mean in the control group, which does exceed that 15% threshold. However, that lower bound of the confidence interval does overlap and go below that 15% threshold, being at 6.5%. So no statistically significant difference. However, the actual mean percent improvements were practically and clinically meaningful in the ACFT specific periodized physical training group. So in summary, there was a statistically significant difference in post-test scores for the hand release push-up and the sprint drag carry between both groups. Again, these greater scores were favoring the ACFT specific periodized physical training group. And although there was no statistically significant difference in post-test scores for the 3-repetition maximum deadlift, the standing power throw, leg tuck, and actual total ACFT score, the mean percent improvements were practically significant based on the 95% confidence intervals, this confidence interval range for these individual measures, favoring the ACFT specific training group. And of note, again, like we mentioned previously, for the 2-mile run, there was neither a statistically significant or clinically significant difference between the two groups in 2-mile run scores following the 10-week intervention period. Limitations. So again, there were these large confidence intervals about the pre and post-test ACFT scores for all the groups. So really soldiers of all fitness levels were included in the study. So you could have anywhere from a range of lower performing scores all the way up to very higher performing scores. The actual ACFT specific periodized physical training group was really designed as a holistic approach for soldiers with generally lower scores. So lower baseline scores are likely to improve more than soldiers with higher baseline scores, as neither of these programs were individualized, the standard unit physical training group or the ACFT specific physical training group. Soldiers who would normally be scoring higher would likely need more of a slightly tweaked individualized program just to meet the specific limitations that they're encountering if they're already doing well in many of the other events. The other limitation is that there's no universal standard requirement for physical training activities that are planned across the Army. Typically, running and road marching are a common denominator with this. However, some of the other things, such as sprints, hill sprints, different dragging and carrying tasks relative to the sprint, drag, carry, hex bar deadlifting for the 3 repetition maximum deadlift, these may all have some degree of variability across units on the day-to-day physical training. So therefore, there's likely some variability in actual physical training activities for soldiers who are participating in the standard unit physical training group, as these were likely present across their units. In conclusion, participating in the 10-week ACFT specific periodized physical training group appears to be more effective in improving ACFT total and individual event scores compared to standard unit physical training for U.S. Army soldiers.